Right now, at this exact second, we are seeing the highest number of active global conflicts since the end of World War II.
Yeah, it's a staggering reality.
Think about that for a moment. 61 active conflicts recorded globally in 2024. And yet, at the exact same time that human need has skyrocketed to these historic, unimaginable levels, the global safety net, the very system designed and built over decades to catch the victims of these crises, is actively being dismantled. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're unpacking a really staggering juxtaposition, one that is reshaping the globe right beneath our feet.
It is a profound paradox. We are looking at a fundamental divergence in the geopolitical landscape because, on one hand, you have surging, escalating crises that are highly complex and interconnected.
Right.
But on the other hand, you have a shrinking, almost retreating level of global support. The mechanisms we use to rely on to stop wars or feed the displaced are either completely paralyzed or they are deliberately being taken apart.
And to map this out, we've brought together a stack of incredibly revealing sources for you today. We have the highly anticipated 2026 Emergency Watch List from the International Rescue Committee, or the IRC, which is titled, very appropriately, New World Disorder.
It's a sobering read.
It really is. We're also looking at a January 2026 intelligence report from OC Media, which gives us a localized look at the fragile peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And finally, we have a January 2026 update from the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR, detailing the devastating, escalating civil war in Myanmar.
Our mission today is to figure out how shifting global alliances, highly transactional politics, and a widespread retreat from international cooperation are directly fueling crises on the ground.
Exactly, because we want to move beyond the abstract diplomatic jargon.
Right, because when we talk about a rules-based order collapsing, it sounds like something, only academics care about in a lecture hall. But the reality is that these shifting macro trends are the literal reasons why specific wars are starting.
And why they aren't ending.
Exactly. And why the human fallout is so severe, we are going to connect the macro geopolitical trends directly to the microhuman impacts.
And if you're listening to this thinking, why should I care? I don't live in a conflict zone. This feels like a distant problem. You really need to care because the old rules are evaporating. The entire framework that has governed global security, international trade, and economics since 1945 is fracturing.
It's totally shifting.
Whether you are tracking global markets, trying to figure out why supply chains are suddenly broken, deeply concerned about human rights, or just trying to make sense of the daily headlines, this new paradigm affects how literally every global event will unfold over the next decade.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to start with the blueprint. How does the IRC define this new world disorder?
So the IRC report breaks down the current geopolitical era into three defining features or pillars. The first pillar is what they call more rivals, more risks.
Okay, more rivals. Right. Because for decades, we viewed global geopolitics through the lens of a few major superpowers, primarily the traditional United States, China, and Russia competition.
The classic Cold War and post-Cold War dynamic.
Exactly. That structure, while tense, had a certain predictability to it. But that paradigm is fractured. We now have a much wider, highly ambitious cast of regional powers pushing their own narrow, often nationalistic agendas. Power has dispersed across the globe.
So instead of a chessboard with two or three major players controlling all the pieces, it's a board where half the pieces suddenly have their own independent strategies.
That's a great way to put it.
Like a regional power in the Middle East or a mid-sized economic power in Asia no longer feels the need to fall in line with Washington, Beijing, or Moscow. They are playing their own game.
And that leads directly to the second pillar, which the IRC calls shifting alliances. The era of long-standing, rock-solid strategic alliances is effectively dead.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. Historically, alliances were often built on a foundation of shared values, democratic ideals, or broad historical ties. You picked a block and you stayed with it. Today, we have entered what the IRC calls a marketplace of influence.
A marketplace?
Yes, it's an era of multi-alignment. Actors, whether they are nation states, regional elites, or even armed non-state groups, are just shopping around. They look for whichever external backer offers them the best terms in the current moment without being tied down to any long-term ideological commitment.
It's honestly like going from an exclusive lifetime country club membership to just swiping on a dating app for whatever you need that weekend.
Yes.
Like, you need weapons, swipe right on this country. You need diplomatic cover of the UN, swipe right on the... There is absolutely no expectation of long-term loyalty.
The loyalty is entirely conditional. And that brings us to the third pillar, Transactional deal-making.
Transactional deal making. Okay, break that down.
Because alliances are fluid and rivalries are multiplying, international engagement has shifted dramatically. Long-term, rules-based cooperation is out. Short-term, power-based, zero-sum bargaining is in.
So no one is thinking 20 years down the line anymore.
Barely even 5 years. Agreements are made purely based on what immediate material gain can be extracted, rather than building a sustainable cooperative future. A treaty isn't about mutual prosperity anymore. It's about what physical assets or leverage can be secured today.
I want to ground this in reality because reading these reports about the disintegrating international order can feel a bit theoretical to people.
Yeah.
How does this transactional, multi-aligned chaos actually look in practice? Let's take the United Nations, for example.
The UN Security Council is the most glaring example of this breakdown. This is the body theoretically designed and empowered by international law to prevent crises from spiraling out of control.
Right? They can issue binding resolutions, enact sanctions, authorize peacekeeping missions.
Exactly. But because of this new, intense transactional rivalry, it is completely gridlocked. The data in the IRC report is incredibly telling. Between 2016 and 2025, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council used their veto power 49 times.
39 times. That feels like a massive escalation.
Compare that to just 19 times in the entire decade before that.
Wow, from 19 to 49.
Yes. And those 49 vetoes were largely used to block collective action on the world's worst crises. We're talking about resolutions that would have addressed the conflicts in Ukraine, Gaza, Syria, and Sudan.
So they are actively stopping the safety net from working.
Right. When a permanent member uses a veto, they are often protecting a regional ally or a transactional partner from accountability. When the very institutions designed to enforce international rules are gridlocked by these transactional rivalries, the rules essentially cease to exist in any meaningful way.
And when the rules evaporate, you get what the IRC report calls the age of impunity.
The psychological shift for aggressive actors here is profound. Imagine you are a warlord, a military junta, or a dictator. You suddenly realize that you can wage war, target civilian infrastructure, or block humanitarian aid without facing any unified international consequence.
Because you know the UN is paralyzed.
Exactly. You also know that if one superpower sanctions you, you can simply open up your dating app of alliances, as you put it, and shop around for a new patron to give you diplomatic cover or weapons.
You are completely incentivized to keep fighting. The traditional levers of accountability have been totally dismantled.
They don't work anymore.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because we have a real-time, unfolding example of this exact dynamic playing out. Let's look at the South Caucasus. The OC media source provides a fascinating January 2026 intelligence report from the Armenian Foreign Intelligence Service regarding their relations with Azerbaijan.
This is a perfect case study.
Right. Now, historically, this is an incredibly volatile region that has seen recent brutal conflict. But the report concludes that a military escalation or full-scale war with Azerbaijan in 2026 is actually highly unlikely.
And the reasoning behind that assessment is deeply tied to the New World disorder we just outlined. The intelligence report points to the August 2025 Washington summit, where a peace deal was initialed between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
The United States heavily mediated this process.
They did. But what is truly fascinating is how Armenia strategically pivoted to get to this point. It is a masterclass in navigating the new marketplace of influence.
Because for decades, Armenia's security was ostensibly guaranteed by Russia through the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. For those listening who might be unfamiliar, the CSTO is essentially Russia's version of NATO for select post-Soviet states.
Right. It has an Article 4 provision, much like NATO's Article 5, which states that an attack on one member is an attack on all.
But when Azerbaijan launched military offensives against Armenian territory in recent years, the CSTO essentially sat on its hands.
The old historical alliance completely failed to protect Armenia. Russia was heavily distracted by its own conflicts and possessed complex transactional interests with Azerbaijan. In this new era, Armenia realized the rigid legacy alliance was a liability rather than a shield.
So they adapted. They formally froze their membership in the Russia-led CSTO in early 2024.
And the 2026 intelligence report explicitly predicts that unfreezing this membership will almost certainly not happen. They realized the old protector was gone, so they went shopping in the geopolitical marketplace for a new guarantor.
That search leads directly to the transactional deal-making aspect of the IRC's blueprint. A major component that emerged from the Washington summit was the Agreement on the Trump Route, or TIPP.
This is critical.
It is a massive infrastructure project designed to connect Azerbaijan to its exclave, Nakhchivan, by building a transit corridor straight through sovereign Armenian territory.
And we have to impartially report the facts here, regardless of the politics involved. The mechanics of this deal perfectly illustrate the IRC's point.
Right. The U.S. mediated this agreement between two warring nations. But the terms of the deal stipulate that the United States receives a 74% share in the TRI-PP Development Company, the entity that will oversee and manage this critical infrastructure.
This perfectly illustrates the third pillar of modern diplomacy. This is not a peace treaty built purely on shared democratic values, mutual apologies, or deep historical reconciliation.
No, it's a business deal.
Exactly. It is a fragile agreement cemented by a massive economic transaction involving an external superpower. The U.S. acquires a controlling stake in a highly strategic geographic corridor, and in exchange, it essentially guarantees the agreement through its economic weight. It is an incredibly pragmatic zero-sum arrangement.
But the intelligence report also warns that this kind of transactional peace is incredibly fragile. Just because a deal is initial doesn't mean the danger evaporates.
Because the underlying rivalries haven't been resolved, the disorder simply shifts to a new domain. The Armenian Intelligence Agency warns of a massive anticipated increase in hybrid threats. They are preparing for coordinated disinformation campaigns, severe election interference, and digital warfare, all expected to peak ahead of Armenia's 2026 parliamentary elections. The assessment notes that external regional powers who feel sidelined by this new U.S. brokered deal are highly likely to engage in malign, covert activities to disrupt the peace and regain their influence.
The report specifically calls out the rhetoric coming from Baku. Even with a peace deal moving forward, Azerbaijan's military budget is rising at a rate that far exceeds spending in other domestic sectors.
Plus, there is this pervasive state-promoted propaganda referring to sovereign parts of Armenia as Western Azerbaijan.
Right. The intelligence agency is actively assessing if this narrative is being hardened into a new national ideology that might be used as a future bargaining chip or a pretext for future action once the geopolitical winds shift again.
If you were tracking global events, you might see a headline about a peace deal in the Caucasus and assume the international system is functioning as intended. But beneath the surface, the New World disorder dictates that this peace is built on shifting purely economic transactions.
It is haunted by the hybrid warfare of sidelined actors.
Exactly. And it is incredibly fragile. The absence of active kinetic war does not mean the presence of a stable, rules-based peace.
That is a chilling distinction to make. The absence of active war does not mean the presence of stable peace. And unfortunately, for much of the world right now, even the absence of war is a luxury they do not have.
Right.
Let's look at the sheer human toll of this global unraveling. The statistics in the IRC report are, frankly, hard to wrap your head around.
We have to remember that behind every macro-level political failure we've been discussing, there is a human life entirely disrupted. The watch list highlights that in 2024, there were 61 active conflicts globally. That is the highest number since 1945.
The fallout from those 61 conflicts is immense. 117.3 million people have been forcibly displaced globally.
It's an astronomical number.
To put that in perspective for you, that is roughly the entire population of Mexico or France and Italy combined, just wandering, seeking safety, having lost their homes and livelihoods. And 80% of those displaced people originate from just the 20 countries listed on the IRC's emergency watch list. Furthermore, there are 239 million people worldwide in active need of humanitarian assistance just to survive the year.
And here's where the divergence between human need and global empathy becomes truly alarming. We have 239 million people in need, driven by a record high number of conflicts.
Yeah.
In previous decades, you would expect the global community to rally, to pool resources, to increase funding to meet this historic crisis. Instead, we are seeing the exact opposite. We are witnessing the systemic collapse of aid. While the needs are skyrocketing, the funding is plummeting.
The financial numbers on this are just as shocking as the conflict statistics. The report projects a $31.1 billion fall in aid in 2025 from the 17 largest members of the Development Assistance Committee, or the DAC.
For context, the DAC is a forum of many of the world's largest bilateral aid donors. A significant portion of that massive drop is driven by domestic policy shifts in major donor nations who are increasingly adopting that transactional mindset we discussed.
Again, keeping things strictly factual and impartial. The IRC report details that between January and March of 2025, 83% of U.S. aid programs were canceled.
Let's pause and think about what cutting 83% of those programs actually means on the ground. This isn't just bureaucratic reshuffling.
Oh, no.
This includes vital funding for maternal and child health, gender-based violence prevention, and critically, epidemic surveillance.
The cancellation of epidemic surveillance is a perfect example of how short-term transactional thinking creates massive long-term global risks.
Exactly. These programs are designed to detect outbreaks of infectious diseases in fragile states before they become global pandemics.
When the largest historical donor slashes 83% of its programs across the board, the shockwaves across the fragile world are catastrophic. It removed the early warning systems that protect everyone, including the donor nations themselves.
And it's not just the total amount of aid dropping, it's also a fundamental shift in where the remaining aid is actually going.
Right. According to the data, only 25% of current global aid actually makes its way to fragile and conflict-affected countries.
Meanwhile, donor countries are increasingly utilizing official development assistance ODA to cover their own domestic costs.
ODA is the gold standard metric for foreign aid, right? It's supposed to be government aid designed specifically to promote the economic development and welfare of developing countries.
It is. But there is a technical loophole that allows donor countries to count the money they spend on hosting refugees within their own borders for the first year as ODA.
So they aren't sending it abroad.
Exactly. The report shows that over 13% of total ODA, roughly $30 billion, is now being spent domestically by donors. The money never leaves the donor country.
It never reaches the conflict zones to address the root causes of the displacement.
It is a symptom of nationalism actively reshaping foreign policy. Donors increasingly want a visible, immediate return on their aid, or they need to use those funds to manage intense domestic political pressures regarding migration.
Right, because engaging in long-term complex poverty reduction or stabilization in highly volatile regions doesn't offer a quick political win.
So the resources are pulled back. It represents a fundamental retreat from the very concept of a shared global safety net.
To really understand what a dismantled safety net looks like, we have to listen to the people holding the line. The IRC report includes some incredibly powerful accounts from the workers on the ground.
They do.
Ebtehal Ghanem, a coordinator in Sudan, describes a reality where food insecurity has reached unimaginable crisis levels. She reports that households are now eating just one meal a day, and many are resorting to eating leaves or animal feed just to stave off starvation.
And Kelly Kisarak, a nutrition coordinator in Khartoum, issued a desperate warning. She noted that their clinics are seeing children arriving physically weaker each consecutive week as food support is systemically cut.
It's just devastating.
The specialized therapeutic food and medicines they rely on to treat severe acute malnutrition are literally running out. She explicitly states that without an immediate injection of new funding, these children will not survive.
It is heartbreaking. And the ultimate result of this shrinking support is that in 2025, a record 6 countries faced IPC Phase 5 food insecurity. For those who aren't familiar with the classification system, IPC Phase 5 is the absolute highest level. It means catastrophic food insecurity.
It is the technical definition of famine.
I mean, people are dying of starvation every single day. 6 separate countries hit that catastrophic level in a single year.
What is most crucial to understand here is that this level of starvation is rarely caused by a simple lack of food production in the world or even just severe weather events. In the modern era, famine is almost entirely a man-made phenomenon.
It is the result of deliberate, tactical choices made by armed actors.
And that brings us to a terrifying evolution in modern conflict. What's fascinating here is that war is no longer just a political tool used to achieve a specific territorial goal or air a historical grievance. Under the New World disorder, conflict has become a booming, self-sustaining economic enterprise.
The profiteers of chaos. This was one of the most eye-opening and disturbing parts of the deep dive for me. We are seeing the total normalization of conflict for profit. War is now a highly professionalized, multi-billion-dollar global industry.
Because the global system is fractured and alliances are constantly shifting, warlords and armed groups aren't facing unified international pressure to sign peace treaties.
The traditional diplomatic levers, sanctions, asset freezes, travel bans, they are easily bypassed.
Completely bypassed. Instead, these groups are finding that sustained level instability is incredibly lucrative. If you look at the IRC watch list, the examples are stark. In Sudan, the 2 rival factions, the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SF, and the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, aren't just fighting an ideological battle for the soul of the country.
No.
A massive component of their warfare is specifically designed to capture, control, and exploit gold mines and illicit smuggling routes.
They're essentially heavily armed cartels fighting over commodity streams.
Exactly.
And we see an even more entrenched version of this in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC. You have the M23 rebel group and various allied militias operating in the eastern part of the country. They are systematically taxing the mineral trade. The report mentions a specific mining site in Rubaya where they extract coltan.
Coltan is a critical metallic ore. When refined, it becomes tantalum, which is a highly heat-resistant powder used to make capacitors.
It is an essential component in almost every single smartphone, laptop, and electronic device we own.
The armed groups in the DRC aren't necessarily mining it themselves. They are acting as a mafia. They control the access roads and the territories surrounding the mines, and they tax every ounce of coltan that leaves the area.
The intelligence suggests these groups are earning roughly $800,000 a month just by controlling and taxing these mineral routes.
We see the same pattern in Somalia, where the militant group Al-Shabaab operates a highly sophisticated taxation network on trade routes and businesses to fund their insurgency.
Think about the psychological shift we discussed earlier regarding impunity. When war becomes this lucrative, when an armed group is pulling in nearly $1 million a month in illicit taxes, there is absolutely zero incentive for them to ever come to a peace table.
Peace, the rule of law, and functional state institutions would literally mean going out of business for them.
Exactly.
And this localized extortion is supercharged by external powers. The multi-alignment we discussed means external state actors willingly intervene in these civil wars. They sell advanced weapons, drones, and ammunition to the armed groups.
In return, they buy the extracted resources.
The smuggled gold from Sudan, the laundered coltan from the DRC. The minerals are smuggled across porous borders, integrated into the global supply chain, and eventually end up in our electronics.
This creates a closed-loop conflict economy. The external powers get cheap resources and weapons contracts, the local warlords get rich, and the civilian populations are completely trapped in a cycle of violent exploitation.
We have another quote from the ground that really brings the reality of this home.
Yeah, from Jean-Claude Kahindo. He's a staff member for a local partner organization in Goma, DRC. He describes how the conflict economy just suffocates everyday life. He notes that the formal banks are closed, basic food prices have skyrocketed due to the taxation on the roads, and simply getting a meal or accessing basic medical care is a daily, exhausting struggle.
While the armed groups are making hundreds of thousands of dollars, the civilians are financially and physically trapped in a war zone.
We must also highlight the specific disproportionate danger this conflict economy creates for women and girls.
Absolutely. The IRC teams report that in these mining towns, where the illicit economy is booming and the rule of law has entirely vanished, women and girls face severe risks of sexual exploitation and abuse.
When formal economies collapse, desperate individuals trying to access basic work, food, or essential goods are frequently preyed upon by the armed men who control the area.
The breakdown of order creates a vacuum where the most vulnerable are exploited for profit.
It's a vicious, self-sustaining cycle. The geopolitical disorder fuels the conflict economy. The conflict economy provides the funds to prolong the war, and the prolonged war continually devastates the civilians.
To see exactly how a country is systematically torn apart by these exact global trend-shifting alliances, transactional diplomacy, and conflict economies, we are going to zoom in on our CFR report.
Let's talk about the utter devastation of Myanmar.
Myanmar is perhaps the most comprehensive, tragic case study of the New World disorder in action today. It perfectly encapsulates how a domestic political crisis is hijacked, prolonged, and intentionally complicated by the retreat of global cooperation and the rise of transactional opportunism.
Let's unpack the timeline to give everyone listening the necessary context, because the current civil war didn't just happen overnight. We are now 4 years out from the military coup of February 2021, but the roots go much deeper.
Since gaining independence from British rule in 1948, Myanmar has struggled immensely with military dictatorships and complex ethnic conflicts.
Right. In 1990, they actually held democratic elections, and Aung San Suu Kyi's party, the National League for Democracy, the NLD, won in a massive landslide. But the military junta simply refused to recognize the results and placed her under house arrest for years.
The military then spent the next 2 decades trying to enshrine their power through a so-called roadmap to democracy. This culminated in the drafting of a 2008 constitution that practically guaranteed their ultimate control, regardless of election outcomes.
How did they do that?
They reserved 25% of all parliamentary seats specifically for the military. which effectively gave them veto power over any constitutional changes. They also retained control over the most crucial government ministries: defense, border affairs, and home affairs.
Then in 2015, they hold elections again. The NLD wins another sweeping victory, and we see the formation of a very fragile power sharing agreement between the civilian government and the military.
But during this period, the world witnessed the horrific ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya Muslim minority in Rakhine State in 2016 and 2017.
The military's brutal systemic crackdowns involving mass burnings of villages and widespread atrocities forced over 700,000 Rohingya to flee across the border into Bangladesh, creating one of the largest refugee camps in the world.
Tragically, the civilian government leadership at the time defended the military's actions on the international stage, which deeply isolated Myanmar's civilian leadership from their traditional Western democratic allies.
Then, in November 2020, the NLD won another massive, undeniable election victory. The military, sensing a true existential threat to their long-term grip on power and economic assets, claimed massive voter fraud without evidence.
In February 2021, they executed a brutal coup d'etat, detaining the civilian leadership and sparking mass, nationwide peaceful protests.
And the military responded to those peaceful protests with lethal force, gunning down hundreds of civilians in the streets. But the people of Myanmar didn't back down. An opposition force quickly formed the National Unity Government, the NUG, acting as a shadow civilian government.
They formed an armed wing, the People's Defense Force, or PDF.
And this is where the map of Myanmar today looks completely fractured. 4 years after the coup, the military junta only controls about 21% of the country's territory.
The resistance, which is a complex coalition of the PDF and various long-standing ethnic armed organizations, now holds roughly 42% of the territory.
The human cost is staggering. Over 3 million people are internally displaced, and an estimated 75,000 are dead.
The turning point militarily, the moment that truly put the junta on the defensive, was Operation 127, launched in October 2023.
A powerful coalition called the Three Brotherhood Alliance, made up of the Arakan Army, the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, and the Tong National Liberation Army, launched a massive, highly coordinated offensive.
They systematically overran and seized over 180 military outposts, primarily in northern Shan State near the Chinese border.
It was a humiliating defeat for the military that pushed them out of the Baymar heartland and shattered the myth of their invincibility.
So if the military is losing so much territory, suffering massive casualties, and facing a deeply unpopular war against its own citizens, how are they surviving?
This is where we connect Myanmar back to the macro theme of the New World Disorder. How does a globally condemned, failing junta keep fighting?
They survive precisely through the marketplace of influence. When the coup happened in 2021, traditional Western powers placed heavy economic sanctions on the junta, freezing assets and attempting to cut off their access to weapons.
In the old world order, that might have suffocated the regime.
But in the multi-aligned era, the junta simply shopped for new transactional partners. A major, highly detailed Reuters investigation uncovered that Iran stepped in to fill the void.
Between October 2024 and December 2025, Iran shipped approximately 175,000 tons of jet fuel and massive quantities of urea directly to the Myanmar military.
Let's talk about the logistics of that for a second, because 175,000 tons of jet fuel is not a small, under-the-radar shipment.
Not at all. That requires massive tankers, complex maritime routing, and financial systems willing to process the transactions. It is a massive, deliberate lifeline.
It is the fuel that allows the junta to maintain its one true asymmetric advantage: air superiority. While the resistance controls the ground, the junta controls the skies. And they have used that Iranian fuel ruthlessly against their own population.
The CFR report details the horrific results. It powered an overnight airstrike on a hospital in Brong-yu that killed 34 patients and medical staff. It fueled a bombing run on a tea shop in Sagaing, where civilians had gathered to watch a football match, killing 18 people instantly.
The urea shipments are equally concerning, as urea is a dual-use chemical vital for manufacturing improvised explosives.
This is the multi-alignment pillar in deadly action. Sanctions by one bloc are simply bypassed by forming a transactional, opaque relationship with another willing partner.
And then you have China, which serves as the ultimate textbook example of transactional diplomacy in this conflict. China shares a massive, strategically vital border with Myanmar, and their approach is to essentially play a multidimensional chess game where they back all sides simultaneously.
China's goals in Myanmar are purely, coldly pragmatic. They want stability, Not necessarily democracy or human rights, but stability to protect their massive economic interests.
We are talking about critical rare earth mineral mines, vital oil and gas pipelines that run from the Indian Ocean straight into China's Yunnan province, deep sea port access at Kyaukpyu,
Mhm.
and massive belt and road infrastructure projects.
So what do? When the fighting gets too close to their border and threatens trade, they step in and broker temporary ceasefires between the junta and the ethnic armies.
But at the exact same time, they continue providing advanced military hardware and diplomatic cover at the UN for the junta.
And incredibly, they also maintain quiet, back-channel relations with the ousted NLD resistance and various ethnic armed groups.
Exactly. They are hedging every single bet to ensure that no matter who eventually wins control of the country, Chinese economic interests and infrastructure projects are fully protected.
It is the absolute definition of a zero-sum, transactional approach to foreign policy, devoid of any ideological commitment to either side.
Meanwhile, the desperation on the ground for the everyday people of Myanmar is suffocating. The junta has suffered such severe troop losses that by February 2024, they implemented forced conscription laws.
They began forcibly drafting around 30,000 young people.
This caused a massive, tragic exodus. Thousands of young people fled the cities, hiding in the jungles or trying to cross borders, desperate to escape being handed a rifle and forced to fight against their own friends and neighbors in the resistance.
And in a desperate, deeply cynical bid to manufacture some veneer of legitimacy for the international community, the junta attempted to hold a sham three-phase general election in December 2025 and January 2026.
The explicit goal was to transition power to their own military-backed proxy party, the USDP, and claim they had restored a civilian government. But the population entirely rejected the charade.
The resistance organized a massive nationwide silent strike. Instead of marching in the streets where they could be shot, people literally just stayed indoors.
Businesses closed, streets were completely empty, and the country ground to a halt. It was a powerful refusal to legitimize the fake vote.
And the junta's response to people simply staying home. They arrested over 200 people on absurd charges of voting law violations.
You have a country where the formal economy is collapsing, the youth are fleeing forced conscription, and hospitals are actively being bombed. And this nightmare is sustained indefinitely because external actors are willing to sell fuel, weapons, and diplomatic cover for their own strategic gain.
Myanmar perfectly demonstrates how the erosion of global norms allows a localized conflict to fester into a permanent crisis.
When there is no unified international pressure, and when regional powers prioritize their own transactional economic interests over human rights and stability, a civil war ceases to be an anomaly and simply becomes a brutal, permanent status quo.
Which brings us to one final, deeply concerning compounding factor from the IRC report. As if the geopolitical fragmentation, the multi-billion-dollar conflict economies, and the shifting alliances weren't enough, we have to look at the fraying safety net in the context of climate change.
The IRC specifically identifies this dynamic as the end of empathy.
This is where the divergence between overwhelming human need and global support becomes arguably the most acute. We know, based on decades of data, that climate change acts as a massive threat multiplier.
It dramatically increases the frequency, severity, and unpredictability of natural shocks, prolonged droughts, devastating floods, extreme weather events.
And the communities most fundamentally vulnerable to these climate shocks are exactly the same communities currently trapped in the conflicts we've been discussing.
Their infrastructure is destroyed, their governments are non-functional, and they have no resources to adapt.
But the global financial response to this reality is completely misaligned. The IRC report notes that there is currently a $1.9 trillion global climate finance budget.
1.9 trillion.
That is a staggering amount of capital mobilized to fight climate change. But less than 1% of that, just $7.8 billion, actually goes toward climate adaptation projects in conflict-affected, highly climate-vulnerable countries.
The disparity is shocking, but the economic logic behind it ties right back to our transactional theme. More than 90% of global climate finance is invested in stable, middle-income, or high-income countries.
Why? Because the capital flows where it is easiest and safest to generate a return. It is purely transactional.
Donors, private investors, and large development banks want to see a tangible return on their green investments. It is infinitely easier to finance a massive solar farm in a stable European or Asian country than it is to build sustainable, climate-resilient water infrastructure in a war zone where it might be bombed the next day.
The result of this risk-averse approach is that 15 of the 20 countries on the IRC's watch list are officially classified as extremely underfunded for climate adaptation.
Afghanistan is a glaring, tragic example of this blind spot. The country is currently suffering its absolute worst drought in 30 years. The lack of water has devastated their agriculture.
The report notes they have lost $3 billion in climate-related economic losses. That is a fifth of their entire national GDP wiped out by drought.
Over 80% of their population depends directly on agriculture for survival. Yet, because of the geopolitical realities and the international isolation of the Taliban government, Afghanistan is almost completely ignored by global climate initiatives.
The political gridlock at the international level means that the vital climate funding simply doesn't reach the local farmers who are literally running out of water and watching their crops turn to dust.
This systemic failure raises a profound question about the fundamental values underpinning the international system today. The IRC refers to this specific dynamic as the end of empathy.
In a highly transactional world order, core humanitarian principles, the simple idea that people deserve assistance simply because they are human beings who are suffering, are being steadily replaced by a cold, calculated calculus of national or financial interest.
And we are seeing that that loss of empathy is deadly, not just for the victims of conflict, but for the people trying to help them.
Even aid workers, the individuals dedicating their lives to delivering food and medicine, are now routinely seen as pawns, bargaining chips, or legitimate military targets.
The statistics are absolutely horrifying. By September 2025, 617 aid workers have been killed, kidnapped, or seriously wounded. And 96% of those incidents happen within the watch list countries.
The rules of war, the Geneva Conventions that were supposed to protect non-combatants and humanitarians, are being openly flouted. Aid is increasingly and deliberately blocked, weaponized, and used as a tactical tool of war.
We saw it clearly with the naval blockades, border closures, and inspection delays in Gaza. We see it with the military in Myanmar intentionally cutting internet access, delaying visas for aid workers, and restricting travel to rebel-held areas.
And we see it in Sudan, with authorities systematically and intentionally obstructing aid convoys from reaching starving populations.
Starvation and disease are no longer just unfortunate byproducts of war. They are being actively deployed as cheap, effective, tactical weapons.
And the knock-on public health effects of this are tragic and entirely preventable. Because aid workers can't access populations, and because funding for things like epidemic surveillance is slashed, preventable diseases are surging back with a vengeance.
We are seeing massive, deadly outbreaks of measles, cholera, and diphtheria in these conflict zones.
In 2024 alone, nearly 20 million children globally missed out on basic routine vaccines. The hard-won public health progress of the last 50 years is actively, rapidly reversing. So what does this all mean? We've covered a massive, heavy amount of ground today.
It means that the fundamental architecture of global stability is broken. The safety nets are fraying and the guardrails are gone. We need to clearly understand the new rules of this highly transactional game if we have any hope of navigating it, let alone fixing it.
Let's synthesize this journey. We started by exploring the IRC's blueprint of the New World disorder. A fractured world characterized by more regional rivals, constantly shifting alliances, and purely short-term transactional deal-making.
We saw how this dynamic creates a highly fragile temporary peace in the South Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan, driven by massive infrastructure deals like the TRPP route, rather than deep historical reconciliation.
We analyzed how this same disorder has birthed multi-billion-dollar conflict economies in Africa, where armed groups in Sudan and the DRC fight endlessly for illicit control of gold and coltan, trapping civilians in a nightmare.
And we witnessed the devastating, highly localized consequences of all these global trends converging in Myanmar, where a brutal military junta survives a massive popular uprising through imported Iranian jet fuel and cynical, multi-aligned diplomacy.
The overriding theme of this entire deep dive is a terrifying divergence. Fundamental human needs, record levels of displacement, mass starvation, and civilian conflict deaths are at historic, unprecedented highs.
Yet at the exact same time, global cooperation, diplomatic problem solving, and international humanitarian funding have retreated to historic lows.
The key takeaway for you, the listener, is that this is not an isolated phenomenon happening over there. The normalization of conflict, the rise of total impunity, and the death of the rules-based international order fundamentally affect the economic and physical security of the entire globe.
Globalized supply chains, international health security, climate stability, they are all deeply intertwined.
When the rules evaporate in one region, The ripple effects, whether in the form of disrupted mineral markets, unchecked pandemics, or mass migration, eventually reach everyone's shores.
Which leaves us with a final, perhaps highly provocative thought to consider. If traditional nation states and international bodies like the UN are actively retreating from their historical roles as peacekeepers and guarantors of global stability,
Right.
and if diplomacy is becoming purely transactional and economically driven, could the future of global stability paradoxically rely on massive multinational corporations?
Oh, that is a wild, fascinating angle. Expand on that.
Think about the incentives. If endless war and geopolitical disorder continually disrupt globalized supply chains, block multinational trade routes, and destroy emerging consumer markets, prolonged conflict is ultimately terrible for global business.
A tech giant cannot manufacture smartphones if the coltan supply chain in the DRC completely collapses into absolute anarchy.
Global shipping companies lose billions if maritime routes are constantly harassed by proxy militias. If sovereign states abdicate their responsibility to maintain international order, will massive corporate entities, driven entirely by their own transactional need for stable markets, predictable resource extraction, and reliable supply chains, become the new unintended enforcers of peace?
Will we see a future where a massive multinational conglomerate uses its immense, undeniable economic leverage to financially choke warlords or force rogue governments to the negotiating table simply to keep the global economy churning? That is a slightly dystopian yet entirely plausible thought experiment to leave you with. A future world where geopolitical peace is enforced not by diplomatic treaties or UN resolutions, but by corporate supply chain demands and quarterly profit margins. Thank you so much for taking this extensive journey with us today. It is incredibly heavy material, but clearly understanding the mechanics of this disorder is the first necessary step to demanding and building something better. Keep questioning the narratives you hear, keep looking for the underlying economic transactions driving the headlines, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.